The evening of May 7th, 1998, began quietly in Philadelphia. Shannon Schieber had settled into her second-floor apartment at 251 South 23rd Street, preparing for what would be her final finance exam of the doctoral program. The young woman had spent the evening with her books, and as the night grew late, she decided to draw herself a bath, leaving her paper on the side of the tub as she prepared to relax. Shannon Schieber had always been extraordinary. From 18 months old, she could recite the alphabet forwards and backwards. By age 3, she was reading at a second-grade level. Her parents, Vicky and Sylvester, watched their daughter excel consistently throughout her academic career, serving as president of her high school and speaking before the city council about education funding. I am a senior in the Student Government Association president at Bethesda Chevy Chase High School this year, Shannon had said during one such appearance. In November, my friend Stephanie and I were the only students to testify at your public hearing on the energy tax. I am here once again to testify for education funding in the FY93 budget. Her achievements continued at Duke University, where she served as president of her freshman class and co-captain of the equestrian team. She graduated with a remarkable triple major in economics philosophy and mathematics. At 22, Shannon earned a full scholarship to the prestigious Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Her goal was simple yet profound: to pursue a career in finance that would help those most in need. When Shannon and her father visited Philadelphia to find housing, they were directed to Center City, where many graduate students lived. It was considered a safe area of the city. They found an apartment Shannon loved and put down a deposit. Just days before her death, Shannon had noticed a man following her around Rittenhouse Square. She walked in circles trying to lose him so he wouldn't see where she lived or gain access to her building. At 2 o'clock in the morning on May 7, 1998, a neighbor across the hall heard something that made him stop what he was doing. Shannon Schieber was screaming for help from her apartment. The neighbor immediately called 911, telling the operator he could hear a choking sound. He classified the call as Priority 1, the highest classification for someone in need of help. After making the call, the neighbor ran downstairs to the couple who lived below Shannon, hoping that with more than one person, they would be able to break down the door and help her. The woman in that apartment explained that her fiancé was away working, so Shannon's neighbor returned upstairs to wait for the police to arrive. When officers arrived 7 minutes later, the woman from the apartment below led them upstairs. Shannon's apartment had fallen quiet. The officers suggested that nobody was actually inside. The neighbor from across the hall remained adamant that he had heard a voice that sounded like Shannon's screaming for help. The woman from below confirmed she had definitely heard a scuffle. The police suggested that perhaps the screams had come not from Shannon's apartment, but from outside on the street. One of the officers went outside and used his flashlight to illuminate her balcony. The curtains were drawn and the door appeared shut. No amount of talking would convince the officers to break into her apartment. They told the neighbors to call 911 immediately if they heard anything else coming from the apartment. Within 5 minutes, the police had left. The following morning, Shannon was scheduled to meet with a study group at 9 o'clock, have lunch with her brother Sean, and then take her final exam before heading home to Maryland to see her parents. When Sean arrived for lunch, friends from the study group told him that Shannon had failed to appear and nobody had been able to contact her. Sean drove to Shannon's apartment and noticed something concerning. While the curtain to her balcony was closed, the balcony door was open. He rang her bell with no response. Sean immediately went to his friend Samantha's house to call his mother Vicky. She told him to go straight back to Shannon's building and find someone to let him in. Sean and Samantha returned and began ringing every doorbell in the building until someone came to the door. It was the neighbor who had called the police the previous night. When Sean explained that his sister had failed to turn up for her study class and no one had heard from her, the neighbor suddenly went pale. He explained that during the night he had heard screams for help and a choking sound, but he hadn't been able to convince the officers to enter her apartment. With not a moment to lose, they went straight to Shannon's apartment and broke down the door. 23-year-old Shannon Schieber was lying naked, face down on her bed. She had been raped and murdered. Sean collapsed when he found her body. Samantha called Vicky, who in turn called her husband Sylvester to tell him what had happened to their daughter. What Shannon and her family didn't know was that a serial rapist had been operating in their area for nearly a year. The pattern was always the same. The victim would be a young woman of college age, and the attacker would break into their apartment before blindfolding and attacking them. On June 20th, 1997, in the 200 block of South 21st Street, a woman told police that a man had broken into her apartment through a window. He climbed on top of her, but she had been able to persuade him not to rape her. She was even able to provide police with one of his hairs, but this hair was not tested for 18 months. On July 11th, 1997, in the 2100 block of Pine Street, a victim had gone home after a night out with friends and climbed into bed. She would later awaken to find herself with wet hair and stripped naked. Her neck had bruises, and the blood vessels in her eyes had burst. Police initially classified this as a burglary. 2 weeks later, on August 6th, in the 1600 block of Pine Street, another victim told police that as she slept, a man had climbed through her window, put a pillow cover over her face and a belt around her neck, before raping her and fleeing. The stains on the sheet were tested, but they were not linked to any other victims until January of 1999, as the DNA from each case had been held on two incompatible computer systems. On August 13th, 1997, in the 1700 block of Pine Street, a woman had woken to find a man in her bedroom. He put one hand on her neck and another over her mouth, placed a pillow over her face, and raped her. DNA taken from this scene was eventually linked to the attack from August 6th. As police investigated Shannon's murder, they worked to piece together what had happened on the night she was killed. After studying, she had started running a bath for herself, leaving a paper on the side, and settled in to relax for the evening. Her second-floor apartment had a small balcony door. The tree near the balcony had barbed wire coiled around it to prevent people from climbing and gaining access to her balcony. Investigators determined that the intruder had pressed his way up through the gap, just 3 feet, between her building and the one next door before swinging onto her balcony. Shannon's screen door was locked, but to combat the humidity, the balcony door was open. It became clear that Shannon had fought her attacker. Books had been knocked off from where they had been positioned beside her bed. She had managed to draw blood from the assailant, which was found on the wall bed and balcony. The intruder had also stolen several items, including a pen, a camera, and jewelry. On the evening after Shannon's murder, Her parents arrived at the apartment around 7 o'clock. The street was filled with police cars and journalists. They pushed past the media outlets, who insensitively threw questions at the grieving couple, and then met with two detectives from the Philadelphia Police's homicide unit. Vicky and Sylvester were taken to the station to be questioned separately about Shannon and whether they knew of anyone who might have wanted to harm her. They were told they would need to stay overnight, as Shannon's body would need to be identified the next day. They were supposed to be taken to the morgue at 9 in the morning, but weren't picked up until 1:30, which delayed the autopsy until 5 in the evening. By this point, the coroner's office was closed for the weekend, so her devastated parents were told they would not be able to release Shannon's body until Monday. After calls to various officials, they were able to have their daughter's body released to them on Saturday morning so they could begin preparations for her funeral. As devout Catholics, Vicky and Sylvester turned to their faith in the face of such immense pain. We went to Mass on Saturday evening, and the assistant pastor announced at the beginning before the Mass started what had happened to Shannon. We go into the Mass, and I got myself in trouble when we got to the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. The prayer reads, in the Catholic Mass, you say that out loud. I'm a pretty literal guy. Words mean things to me. I couldn't say that out loud, Sylvester explained. As the investigation continued, the Philadelphia police issued flyers to various shops in search of the Canon camera that had been stolen from Shannon's apartment on the night she was murdered. Also stolen were hundreds of CDs, a pen jewelry, and a backpack. A fellow student from Wharton was questioned, but DNA testing soon ruled him out. Police initially believed that Shannon's killer was an ex-suitor and that this had been a crime of passion, but this theory didn't yield any leads. In the autumn, Shannon's case was featured 3 times on America's Most Wanted in the hope that someone would come forward with information. The case seemed to be going nowhere. Then a call was made, but it wasn't to the police. An anonymous source contacted the Philadelphia Inquirer with information about the investigation into Shannon's murder. The person said that police had dismissed 2 similar attacks on women who had been assaulted in their own homes but not killed. The source suggested that if police had recognized the pattern earlier, they might have been able to stop the attacker before his crimes escalated to murder. The journalists at the Philadelphia Inquirer decided to investigate these claims, and what they discovered was deeply troubling. They found a culture where victims of rape were ignored and belittled. Detectives had filed away rape cases under a non-criminal classification code, meaning that many went unaddressed. One former detective with the Philadelphia Police had referred to the sex crimes unit as the lying bitches unit and said publicly that women lied about rape about half the time. It was only after 2 years and the series of investigations by the Philadelphia Inquirer that police admitted this was not just isolated carelessness, but a serious issue with culture and attitude within the force. Linking the attacks to one offender alone had taken police 17 months, despite the same pattern each time, and DNA left at the scene in each instance. DNA was tested in only 2 of the cases, and only after the report from the Philadelphia Inquirer. Both of these cases had been classified as non-crimes. These investigations by the Philadelphia Inquirer would later be nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. 2 of the previous rapes had been filed under the classification 2701, which was a non-criminal category deemed trivial and not in need of further action by police. As a result of these investigations, every single case filed under 2701 from the previous 5 years was reviewed again. 863 cases were reclassified as other sexual offenses, and 681 were reclassified as rape. Sylvester believed that the intention of the killer had not been to murder Shannon, but when he heard the officers at the door, he had strangled her to silence her, and then escaped via the balcony. He added that if the public had been warned about the serial attacks, Shannon wouldn't have chosen to live there. If the previous rapes had been connected to the same person, one can only imagine if the response might have been different. One of the officers who had responded to Shannon's apartment that night would later say that he would have called for a supervisor if he had known the call was about a woman who had been screaming for help. The other officer said that only if he had heard the screams himself would he have forced the door open. It would take detectives 8 months to link the 5 rapes from the same area. A former police chief would later remark that the department had been god-awful in dealing with sex crimes, and reform was long overdue. One of the victims had been able to catch a glimpse of her attacker, and a composite sketch was drawn up. A reward of $40,000 was also offered. In July of 1999, FBI profilers were brought in. The profilers believed that this man was very familiar with his surroundings and the wider neighborhood. He was fit and agile, and likely had a history of voyeurism. 15 months after Shannon was killed, the man now dubbed the Center City Rapist struck again. He removed 14 screws from a set of bars to gain entry into a ground-floor apartment and attack the woman inside. Shannon's family would reach out to the parents of this victim and offer their support. One of the officers working on the case had seen an episode of Forensic Files where a serial rapist had been caught using geographic profiling. He reached out to the profiler who had appeared in the episode, Kim Rossmo, hoping he would be able to help. By foot and by helicopter, Kim examined the area in question, then put the addresses of the rape victims and Shannon's address into his program, which provided several areas where the rapist was likely to live. Police went to those areas and put up the composite sketch of the man they were looking for. But then, the attacks suddenly stopped. By this time, police in Philadelphia had come to realize that these attacks had been committed by one individual. It was the diligence of one nurse conducting a forensic medical exam that had finally provided the breakthrough. The attacker had licked one victim's breast, and the nurse had meticulously swabbed her, which finally picked up his DNA. The rapes would soon start up again, but hundreds of miles away in a different state. On May 10th, 2001 in Fort Collins, Colorado, a woman had woken to find a man in her apartment. He had tied her up, covered her eyes, and sexually assaulted her. Within just a few weeks, there would be another attack on the same street. The next victim's husband was tragically dying from cancer, and he and their son had gone away camping, leaving her home alone. The man stood outside and watched, trying to see if there was a dog or a man in the apartment. While she sat at her computer, she heard a noise that made her stop. He quickly launched his attack, covered her eyes, and forced her into the bedroom. He calmly whispered that if she cooperated, he wouldn't hurt her. She said she remembered thinking that she needed to get through this. For her son, he couldn't lose both his parents. After the attack, he ran away, and she was able to call 911. The attacks continued in Fort Collins, but now he had started leaving more evidence, a hat DNA, and someone had seen his car driving away during one of the attacks. He left fingerprints on a balcony. The fingerprints and descriptions of the attacker were sent to police agencies throughout the United States to see if any departments had dealt with anything similar. A police clerk in Philadelphia recognized the pattern and immediately thought of the Center City rapist. The DNA taken from the rape test kits in Colorado were compared to the blood found in Shannon's apartment. The results revealed the truth: they had been committed by the same person. Investigators scoured databases to find men who had been in both areas at the time of the attacks and murder. 319 men were identified as having made financial transactions in Philadelphia and then in Fort Collins during the times in question. They looked at men between 20 and 30 years old who had been living in that part of Philadelphia, which narrowed the pool down to 83 people. This list was sent to police in Colorado and combined with their list of suspects, which had more than 800 people on it. But before these could all be checked, the rapist struck again. In September of 2001, police in Colorado received a letter. Part of it read, "I'm sorry, but I can't let you catch me yet, not in Colorado. I don't even like it here. I'm not a fan of cold weather. I don't even like going up to Fort Collins anymore. You guys are everywhere. I admit I want to get caught. I don't like what I do. It keeps me at a distance from people, and I can't talk to anyone. It gets lonely." The letter also contained details that had not been released to the public, things that only the assailant, the victim, and police knew. Frustratingly, for detectives, there were no fingerprints or DNA on the envelope or letter. It was determined that this was a ploy from the offender to throw detectives off track and make them focus on the letter, which wasn't going to yield any results. With DNA showing that the crimes had been committed by one person, and knowing that there was a 5-year statute of limitations on rape under Pennsylvania law, authorities filed a warrant against the unknown attacker. More than 1,000 tips had come in. One tip was from a woman who said she had dated a man who looked like the person in the sketch. His name was Troy Graves. Another tip came from a neighbor who thought the car used by the rapist was similar to her neighbor's. Her neighbor's name was also Troy Graves. This was a name that appeared on the suspect list in Philadelphia. He had worked for a bank near where the victims of the Center City rapist had lived. Troy had joined the armed forces in 1999 and completed basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. He also attended a missile maintenance school in California and eventually ended up in Wyoming. A month after he arrived at the Air Force Base, he had been reprimanded following an allegation that he had tried to enter the dorm room of a female Air Force captain. An ex-girlfriend told police that on some occasions he would break into someone's apartment, watch them for 15 minutes, and then leave. Although he was based in Wyoming, he lived in Fort Collins, Colorado, just a couple of miles away from where the women had been attacked. The ex-girlfriend also mentioned that he had struggled with sleep and would take walks late at night, coming home with scratches and bruises. She was concerned and tried to get him to explain what was going on, but he wouldn't, and gave various excuses, such as falling over. Officers knew that the man who had killed Shannon had type A positive blood, the same blood type as Troy Graves. Detective Neil Hissam had been dispatched to Troy's house on Ash Drive. Nobody was home, so he left a business card. Troy had been married for about a year, and when his wife got home and found the card, she called Detective Hissam. She explained that her husband was working on the base, but had a dental appointment at 3 o'clock. she called Troy, who got in contact with police and agreed to come in to talk to detectives. He left the base to pick up his wife before heading to the station, not knowing he was already being followed by officers. During questioning, when asked about his criminal history, Troy mentioned there had been an incident on the base in May 2001. Detective Heisem asked if he would be willing to be fingerprinted. Troy said he felt a little weird about it and wanted time to think. Back down. Last question about your fingerprints and DNA 1, 2, and actually coming out another day, just so I can talk to my wife and just make me feel more comfortable. At this point right here, you're no longer free to go. Okay, I'm going to detain you. When his fingerprints were taken, the pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place. They matched the prints found on the victim's balcony in Colorado. His blood was also taken, and this matched the DNA found in Shannon's apartment. On April 23, 2002, 29-year-old Air Force senior airman Troy Graves was arrested in connection with 6 sexual attacks in Colorado. 3 days after his arrest, he was charged with 27 counts, including sexual assault robbery and kidnapping. That same day, he was presented with the charges that had been filed against him in Philadelphia, 50 counts, including rape, aggravated assault burglary, and murder. It later emerged that one of his ex-girlfriends had seen the composite sketch, as had her little girl, who had pointed at the poster and said, "Mommy, that's Troy." It was also revealed that Troy, who had lived at the 4100 block of Baltimore Avenue in Philadelphia, had been stopped by police for questioning in January of 1999, but was released not long after. Not long after he was arrested, Troy told his lawyer that if the death penalty was taken off the table, he would enter pleas of guilty to the rape and murder of Shannon and the rapes and sexual assaults against the other women. He also finally confessed to what had happened that night in Shannon's apartment. He told detectives that he had climbed through the sliding glass door of her balcony and surprised her as she was in the bathroom. After the attack, she had tried to fight him off, biting his left ring finger and drawing blood. She also scratched his face. Troy said he put his arms around her neck to overpower her and stop her, but she fell off the bed. I countered by jumping back on the bed on my knees, which didn't allow her feet to touch the floor. Okay, it was at that point I thought I might have broken her neck. He then said he heard someone knocking at her door 2 separate times, but claimed he didn't hear the police knock. He also said he didn't see the police as he ran off. He said that he had closed her balcony door, and although it was shut when police initially arrived following the call from the neighbor, Sean said that when he went to her apartment, the balcony door was open. The Schieber family argued that this discrepancy suggests that Troy was still in the apartment when police arrived and left the door open after he fled. At a news conference, District Attorney Lynn M. Abraham gave a new explanation for this discrepancy. Sean had opened the door because he was sick at the sight of Shannon's body. Sean disputed these claims, saying, "That's just absolutely preposterous." He added that he had noticed her door was open from the outside before he even went in, and that he didn't go near the balcony door. The friend who was with him when Shannon's body was found also said in a deposition that she too had noticed the balcony door was open before going inside. Although his daughter's killer had now been caught, Sylvester said that the Philadelphia police was in need of change. That part of the case is closed, but the city of Philadelphia needs to change the way it does its policing, he said. As already mentioned, One of the punishments being considered in Pennsylvania was the death penalty. Rooted in their Catholic faith, Vicky and Sylvester were deeply opposed to capital punishment. It was reported that Shannon's family had faced what was referred to as unrelenting pressure to seek the death penalty against Troy. Vicky referred to the experience as being re-victimized by the debate around capital punishment and how some felt it was the only way for them to receive justice. The death penalty wasn't going to honor Shannon's life, and it wasn't going to bring her back. I thought about everything we ever taught Shannon to believe, to turn the other cheek, to show compassion and be forgiving. If you have a set of principles and then don't live by them when you're tested, were they ever your principles to begin with? She said. Sylvester added, during our 49 years of marriage, Vicky has often accused me of being too literal, but I believe words have meaning and should be taken seriously. Upon reflection, I took the meaning of, as we forgive those who trespass against us, and the teaching of St. Matthew's Gospel telling us to turn the other cheek to be fundamental Christian principles. Some ask, what would Jesus do? Often the answer isn't as easy as the question suggests. For us, when it comes to executions, the answer is clear. As we thought through the issues and reflected on our upbringing, we decided we would not be party to a death penalty prosecution. Vicky said that after Shannon's death, she felt Shannon was sitting on her shoulder telling her, "Don't let him kill all of you too." She was telling me to take all that energy and do good with it. She said that by going for the death penalty, she felt it would murder her at the same time as him, that taking another life to satisfy one's own ends was wrong. Shannon's parents also made contact with the victims of Troy graves from Colorado and Pennsylvania, and they were all in support of the couple in not asking for the death penalty. Troy's attorney thanked Shannon's family for their public and vocal opposition to capital punishment. This vocal opposition became the focus of much media interest. In one instance, a talk radio host and local lawyer, Michael Smerconish, published an open letter addressed to Vicky in the Daily News. He said that Shannon's killer should pay with his life, writing that he did not believe that any one citizen's feeling should determine that decision, even if that citizen was a victim. That would result in disparate sentencing in society. Society's interests require serious consideration of a death sentence. We never want another promising young woman to have her life cut short by a murderous thug, but we must consider the deterrence that a death sentence in this case might provide. Sylvester and Vicky wrote an open letter back explaining their opposition to capital punishment. First, as Catholics, they held life to be sacred. Under the circumstances of our daughter's death, our beliefs about appropriate punishment have been severely tested, but we have no choice but to adhere to our principles. Second, they said that capital punishment was often applied in discriminatory and arbitrary ways in society. Finally, they said that the issues with police in failing to link the offenses and classifying reports of rape and sexual assault as non-crimes had resulted in a failure to warn the community and added to the risk for people who lived there. They referenced Shannon being followed around just 2 nights before she was killed. Had she known that a serial rapist was working her neighborhood, she would have been far more concerned about this incident than she was. She likely would have called the police. The open letter said they added that if Smerconish wanted safety for the community, he should have called for accountability from police regarding their handling of cases linked to the Center City rapist and for changes in how they deal with sexual attacks. Shannon's family also took legal action against the Philadelphia police for negligence. The federal lawsuit said that police had missed the opportunity to save her or catch Troy Graves when the call from the neighbor came in. The lawyer for the family told the federal jury that if police in Philadelphia had recognized that the crimes were being committed by one person or taken sexual offenses more seriously, Shannon's murder could have been prevented. He told the jury that officers had originally misclassified one of the sexual attacks as a burglary. Some of the forensic evidence hadn't been analyzed. Allegations of rape had been downgraded or ignored, and police weren't aware of a serial offender. The chief deputy city solicitor, Shelley R. Smith, said that police had acted properly and the city was not responsible for Shannon's death. In 2004, it was reported that the city of Philadelphia was not liable for the death of Shannon Schieber following her family's lawsuit against them. Sylvester was deeply critical of the police department in Philadelphia. "I think the police department in Fort Collins from the beginning of the attacks comported themselves in an extremely professional manner, which should be an embarrassment to Philadelphia." He argued that very few were holding the police to account. "They won't clean it up, and someone needs to demand they clean it up." On May 17, 2002, Troy Graves received a life sentence in Fort Collins, Colorado, for the sexual assaults against 7 women. District Judge Terrence Gilmore, dealing with the cases in Colorado, said he had decided on a life sentence because of the nature of the offenses and the level of fear he had instilled in his victims. It was now time for Troy Graves to face justice in Philadelphia. He entered a plea of guilty to 6 counts of rape and to the murder of Shannon Schieber. He told the court, "To the city of Philadelphia and the victims and the families and friends of the victims, I'm sorry. My deepest sympathy to the Schieber family for their loss, and I thank them for how they've been throughout this." As the court proceedings played out, the second victim of Troy Graves sat at the back of the courtroom. She had been attacked in July of 1997. She'd woken up to find herself covered in bruises and naked. Her case had initially been classified as a burglary. As the details of her case were read out, she broke down in tears. She said, "After the hearing, I'm glad it's over." Judge Benjamin Lerner sentenced Troy Graves to life in prison with no possibility of parole for Shannon's murder, plus 60 to 120 years for the rapes. Shannon's parents welcomed the life sentence. That's exactly what we wanted. We didn't want Graves having the flexibility of ever attacking anyone else again, and that's the satisfaction we got, Sylvester said. One thing that had been made abundantly clear during this investigation was that there needed to be massive change in the police. An external oversight committee was set up, which independently reviewed how police handled cases of rape. Making up the committee were experts in women's legal rights, advocates for children, and staff from the Rape Crisis Center. Carol Tracy, the executive director of the Philadelphia-based Women's Law Project, was asked by the Philadelphia Police to help in the creation of the committee and became a leading member. It brought transparency and independent scrutiny at a time when the public had lost confidence in the police. It is another model departments should learn from, she said. The committee looked into rape reports that had been classified as unfounded, which meant that the report was deemed to not meet the criteria for rape or sexual assault, or that it had been fabricated. In the late 90s, police would file almost a fifth of cases away as unfounded. This was alongside the hundreds that had been incorrectly classified under wrong codes and then buried. The sex crimes unit used by police was originally based in a former horse stable and then in a disused military armory. After having invasive and difficult forensic exams at the hospital, victims would then have to sit and wait in police corridors, often seeing their alleged attackers sitting there in handcuffs. One of those who took part in the initial case review was Lieutenant Tom McDevitt. I remember the day I said, "How did we get this bad? What did we do?" It was eye-opening, like a smack in the face to us. It was a humbling thing that we said, wow, if we really want to be this good, we have to change. Senior Philadelphia sex crimes officer, former Lieutenant Michael Boyle, said people had become complacent. Officers were being careless, and in many cases lazy, and weren't even looking at cases as individual women, but just as a filing code or an overwhelming workload. The culture of police was not helped by a lack of supervision and oversight, poor training, and little funding. Boyle called the attitude that had developed inexcusable and indefensible. If you look in the city of Philadelphia, there were positive developments for us. It came at a tremendous cost, Sylvester said. The reforms seen in the handling of sex crimes in Philadelphia were also implemented in other places like New York and even Ottawa, Canada, where independent groups reviewed how investigations were carried out. Since 2016, the Ottawa Rape Crisis Center had launched 12 pilot programs, all based on the model used in Philadelphia. Sylvester and Vicki Schieber would continue their activism in pushing for the death penalty to be repealed. Vicki's anti-death penalty activism took her to more than 20 states to tell Shannon's story and her experience with the justice system. In a display of extraordinary grace, Vicki has also said that she wanted to talk to Troy Graves. "I want him to know that we aren't angry people with all sorts of vengeance. We want him to find peace." In 2011, in 2011, Vicki was named Abolitionist of the Year by the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. This case remains both heartbreaking and infuriating, from the way sexual attacks were handled to knowing how much Shannon had fought for her life. It is tragic to know that it took something so awful with so many victims for the systems to finally change. Troy Graves will spend the rest of his life in prison for what he did to these women, and there is perhaps some solace in knowing he will never be able to hurt another woman again. As Sylvester said, "The hardest thing to accept is that our daughter did everything she could to call for help. Shannon was a good person who went out of her way to help almost anyone. The one time she needed help, the system didn't work. But one positive thing to come from all of this tragedy is the amazing compassion and work of the Schieber family. For them to hold true to their principles, show such grace and strength, and not seek revenge in the face of such an appalling crime is frankly incredible." Shannon Schieber had her whole life ahead of her, and who knows what amazing things she would have gone on to achieve. But for her to accomplish all that she did in her 23 years is a testament to who she was as a person. As Vicki said, "If you could have written down a wish list and said, 'Dear God, this is what I would love for my first child,' I got everything on that list I would have wanted.